I'm Janice Dean.
I'm David Asman.
I'm Dana Perino, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, April 14th, 2021. I'm Lisa Brady. A tug of war over policing in America, as some call again for change, while others urge caution.
If we want to have an orderly society, there are going to have to be rules that we expect one another to follow, and there's going to have to be someone to enforce that.
I'm Dave Anthony. We've heard a lot lately about Iran's nuclear threat, but what about North Korea? Aside from a few missile tests, it's been kind of quiet.
North Korea typically does something very provocative in the first year of a U.S. and a South Korean administration. So we're expecting that they would do something big.
And I'm Dr. Nicole Sapphire. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
The death of Daunte Wright during a traffic stop arrest in Minnesota has reignited a debate over police reforms and anger. Protests and riots breaking out over Wright's shooting, which happened in the Minneapolis suburb of Brooklyn Center, even as a murder trial continues for former Minneapolis officer Derek Chauvin in the death of George Floyd. President Biden referencing both cases as he met with the Congressional Black Caucus on a broader range of issues Tuesday.
We're in the business, all of us meeting today, to deliver some real change.
But spokeswoman Jen Psaki says the president does not hold the same view as Michigan Democratic Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who tweeted that policing in our country is inherently and intentionally racist and can't be reformed. Psaki says the president's view is that reforms should be implemented and accountability must happen.
That the loss of life is far too high, that these families are suffering around the country, and that the Black community is exhausted from the ongoing threats they feel.
Over the weekend, Maryland, which was the first state to approve a police Bill of Rights decades ago, became the first state to repeal it. The legislature, overriding vetoes on reforms, the Republican Governor Larry Hogan argued went too far, including new standards for the use of force, limits on no-knock warrants, and allowing public access to officers' disciplinary records.
There's no more emotional issue in the public sphere right now than policing.
Jason Johnson is president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund and former deputy commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department.
There's really a lot of public pressure on elected officials and police executives to act very swiftly when one of these cases arises, and very often pressure to act before there can be any investigation of what exactly has happened. So these law enforcement officer Bill of Rights do not involve in any way the process of investigating whether police actions are criminal in nature. All they are protecting officers with respect to their employment. In other words, so that they cannot be fired without any due process, without any investigation. Now more than ever, police officers, although we strongly support improvement in policing, individual officers need to know that they at least will get due process, that when there's been an accusation made in how they've done their job, that there will be some process where there could be an investigation to determine the facts. In this case that's unfolding in Minnesota, the city manager was just fired, within 24 hours of an incident, merely because he suggested that the officer involved should get due process. Not that she shouldn't be fired or that she shouldn't be disciplined or even that she shouldn't be prosecuted, but just that she should receive due process. So if we're going to have an environment where our law enforcement officers, who we should regard as professionals, we should train them as professionals and in other ways treat them as professionals, will feel that their jobs and livelihoods can be taken merely because they're involved in a controversial incident without any form of investigation or due process, we're going to see mass exodus from the profession.
Well, there are some calls to, in essence, do away with policing, at least as we know it. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib tweeting no more policing. She says it's inherently racist in the U.S. and that it can't be reformed. What would you say to her or others like her who are thinking the same thing?
Well, it's just not a serious proposition. Those kinds of statements are made with the intent to be provocative or to play to a certain base. But even since the George Floyd protests and riots of last year, we've seen a change in policing. We haven't seen anything along that scale. We have seen some limited calls to defund in some jurisdictions. One of those jurisdictions was Portland, Oregon, which since those calls to defund has seen a 255% increase in homicides just in their jurisdiction. Nationwide, we've seen about a 25% increase in homicides during that time period. And in cities like Los Angeles, a 50% increase, Milwaukee, almost 100% increase. And I could go on and on down the list.
Is that, let me just ask you one quick question there on that note, though. Is that from funds actually being taken away, or is that a function of officers sort of pulling back?
Yeah, that's largely a function of officers recognizing the environment and understanding that if they're just involved in a controversial incident, that could end their career, that could result in them being charged with a crime and so forth. So it's a result in a sea change in how policing is done. Right now, policing is being done in a much more passive way, whereas I would say pre-George Floyd, in most cities, policing was an active process where officers were encouraged to confront people who they believed were involved in criminal activity and to follow up on those leads and to try to find people illegally carrying firearms and people who are repeat offenders and so forth. And now that has changed. And so my point in all that is that when Rashida Tlaib or anyone else suggests that we just do away with policing, you understand that even limiting the role of police officers has resulted in an explosion of murder across the country. And I don't have to point out this fact to any of your listeners that the overwhelming majority of those murder victims are poor and are Black. And so if we really believe Black Lives Matters, we need to gauge our rhetoric accordingly and understand that policing in many of these communities that we're concerned about is vital to the success of the community.
What about former President Obama's call for reimagining policing? And he's not the only one who's used those words. It's kind of a softer tone than defunding police. Is there a way to reimagine policing then?
I think we're all of our ears are open to that. I don't know what that means. I think it's naive to think that it sort of broadcasts a signal that police are the problem. If there is a problem, where are those problems, and what is the likelihood of fixing them? For example, one of the issues that we talk about routinely are how police deal with people with mental illness. Well, for many years now, police have been heavily involved in the business of honing their response to individuals in mental health crisis and in partnering with mental health professionals, social workers, and others. In some cities, there's a dual response where mental health providers respond with police officers to these kinds of incidents, where police officers are receiving better training and better equipment and better ways of diffusing and handling individuals in mental health crisis. That is one success story. So if that's what former President Obama means when he says reimagine policing, I'm completely in line with that. On the other hand, if he means that we should encourage police officers to not enforce the law, or if we should repeal much of the criminal code, I don't agree with that. If we want to have an orderly society, there are going to have to be rules that we expect one another to follow, and there's going to have to be someone to enforce that. Listen, if there's a way to make policing better, I think everyone in policing is open to that. But if we're just going to use talking points and platitudes, that's not going to solve this problem.
This problem is also complicated by some inherent disagreements. Jason Johnson says police use of force in general has been declining for decades, and that the media's portrayal of an epidemic of violence, including against African Americans, is false. But others argue it's not just about the actual statistics.
There's those interactions that are reported, and there are those interactions that are unreported.
Richard Fowler is a radio host and Fox News contributor.
What the media talks about are the interactions that are reported, the ones where there's body camera footage, the ones that are so terrible that we can't look away, like the incidents of George Floyd or the one of Daunte Wright, which happened a couple of days ago. But there are instances that happen every day where, even in my own community, where I've seen police officers raise their voice at children, right? Or I've seen police officers throw children on cars, or the many instances that we see happening in our public schools where police officers are put in places resources to provide discipline to our young people. And I'm not saying, and I'm not an advocate for abolishing the police or defunding the police. What I'm saying is we need to create a new contract when it comes to how policing is done in this country, so that the community is not seen as a threat, but rather the community is seen as a partner in how we actually create public safety.
So the question is, and I know this is like the $1 million question, how to make those kinds of reforms?
I think we can start very simply. In the press conference we saw that took place in Brooklyn Center, and the mayor was asked how many of the police officers that work in Brooklyn Center live in Brooklyn Center. And the mayor's response was quite puzzling. Of the 49 police officers that work in Brooklyn Center, 0 of them live in that city. And that's Brooklyn Center is just one. Brooklyn Center, Minnesota is just one example of what's happening across the country, right? If police officers live in community, then they're going to be more respectful of the folks they live in. They're going to have a better sense. There's going to be more community between them and the people that live in that community, right? If you live in the community, you work in the community, people know who you are. That's one step. The other step is, how do we create better training protocols, right? How do we train folks on implicit bias? How do we train folks on how to deal with citizens in the LGBTQIA community? How do we train people on cultural nuances and cultural norms? And that's just the beginning, but it begins with, because it's not just about policy, because in many of these cases, whether it's the case of George Floyd, whether it's the case of Eric Garner, much of the policy is against what the police officers did, right? I mean, the chokehold that was used against Eric Garner in Staten Island is an illegal chokehold. So it's not that the police department's written policy is saying that you should go around and you should choke people to death. It's how these officers are doing their jobs in the streets and how we provide better training to them, so that this doesn't continue to be the norm of you could do things without getting punished, or do things without saying, hey, listen, there's consequences to your actions.
Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib tweeted out after Daunte Wright's killing in suburban Minneapolis, no more policing, that it can't be reformed. I know you've said you're not an advocate for abolishing the police or defunding the police, but do comments like that hurt the effort to get police reforms passed?
Well, I think comments like that are what the media chooses to focus on, instead of focusing on the vast majority of folks who are really actually fighting for meaningful reform. Case in point, we're talking about Rashida Tlaib, and 2 weeks ago, the District of Columbia's Police Reform Commission released a 30-page report of citizens who came together and citizens and advocates came together and wrote a plan on how they want to reform their police department. No mainstream media outlet covered it. Right. But they should have covered it, because it's when citizens come together with police and say, how do we make this better? How do we end this untenable situation? And how do we actually work together to create a new contract that makes everybody feel safe and actually restores trust between community and police, and actually allows the police to protect and serve the community, and the community not feel fearful about their interactions with policing. But instead, what ends up happening is we focus on one tweet from one congresswoman instead of the work that's happening in cities across America, where mayors and community members are coming together and they're trying to find ways to make the situation better.
Richard Fowler, radio host, Fox News contributor, always grateful for your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
This is Dr. Nicole Saphier with your Fox News commentary. Coming up.
Iran has been a big issue, with the U.S. trying to rejoin the international nuclear deal. But this past weekend's attack at an Iranian facility complicated things, with Iran blaming Israel, vowing revenge, and planning to increase uranium enrichment closer to weapons-grade levels. But what about North Korea? President Biden recently told reporters it remains his top foreign policy issue after 2 missile tests.
There will be responses if they choose to escalate.
The president added he's open to diplomacy.
But it has to be conditioned upon the end result of denuclearization.
But there's no detailed policy plan yet.
We don't really know what the policy is yet, But I think there's some knowns and some unknowns.
Bruce Klingner used to be the deputy CIA division chief for Korea, now a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation.
The knowns would be that Biden and others have already said they're going to go back to sort of a traditional U.S. policy or diplomacy approach of a bottom-up, where you have to have progress at diplomatic level, working level meetings with North Korea towards an actual denuclearization agreement before you get rewarded with having a summit. And that's what administrations of both parties have been doing for decades. He's also said that there will be continued focus on denuclearization rather than arms control, which some Korea experts are advising. You know, the two things we don't know yet are what would be the parameters of an acceptable agreement for the Biden administration with North Korea, and the second is how firmly will they enforce not only UN resolutions but U.S. laws. So previous administrations of both parties have underachieved even on fully enforcing our own laws. So those are the things that I'll be looking for whenever they unveil the policy.
All right, we haven't even heard much from North Korea regarding the U.S., except for how Kim Jong-un's sister put out some sort of a statement warning the Biden administration not to cause a stink, whatever they mean by that. And if they do, they wouldn't be able to sleep in peace for the next 4 years. So that typical rhetoric?
Yeah, it is. What they've said in the last several years, which was consistent with previous ones, is basically, you know, we're not interested in dialogue with you unless you give us what we want. Throughout 2019, they said that their patience is running out with the U.S., that their self-imposed moratorium on nuclear and ICBM tests, which was irrelevant because they're required not to do any kind of tests under UN resolutions, you know, that their patience would end and sometime in 2020 they would do something dire, though unspecified. And then they didn't do anything, and that might have been because of COVID. And North Korea typically does something very provocative in the first year of a U.S. and a South Korean administration. So we're expecting that they would do something big.
We have seen them do a couple of different missile tests in recent weeks. They were sort of back-to-back in a matter of days. One was the short range, the other was long range, right?
Well, what they did was two different tests. One was cruise missiles, which were short range, and because they're cruise missiles, they're not a violation of UN resolutions. And then a couple of days later, they did two short-range ballistic missiles, and because they were ballistic, those are violations of the UN resolutions.
All right, what is the difference? Because I don't know if everybody knows the difference between those two missiles, cruise and ballistic.
Right. Well, a cruise missile sort of, you know, goes in a straight line, as it were, and a ballistic missile kind of goes in a parabola. Like if you throw a high-fly baseball, it sort of goes up on a trajectory and then comes down. And the UN resolutions, they identify restrictions not by the range of a missile, but by whether it uses, quote, ballistic missile technology, end quote.
President Trump had two approaches to North Korea. First, insulting Kim Jong-un, calling him Rocket Man, threatening to annihilate the country, and then he tried to make friends.
Our unprecedented meeting, the first between an American president and a leader of North Korea, proves that real change is indeed possible.
Saying at their first summit in 2018,
Chairman Kim and I just signed a joint statement in which he reaffirmed his unwavering commitment to complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
But that didn't happen, and President Trump walked out of their second summit months later.
No, there was no progress towards denuclearization. At least it tested the hypothesis that some people had put forward, where they tended to blame the United States for the impasse and saying that, well, in North Korea, given the very hierarchical system they have, only Kim Jong-un can make decisions. So if only the U.S. would deign to have a meeting between the U.S. and North Korea leader, then everything would be solved. Well, we tried that, and it didn't show to be any more successful than the previous approaches. So, you know, regardless of political party or administration in the U.S., the common denominator for the lack of progress or lack of success on denuclearization has always been Pyongyang. It's always they're the ones that have either cheated on agreements or not fulfilled what they promised to do.
You referenced COVID. The North Koreans have been claiming there isn't a single coronavirus case in that country, that they've been able to ward off COVID somehow. I mean, obviously the country shut off. It's hard to get in there. What do you know about the coronavirus in that country?
Well, I think it's pretty laughable that they claim they haven't had a single case. And then what happened a few months ago was a North Korean who had defected to the south redefected to the north. And what they were going to do was blame him for every single COVID case that occurred in North Korea had they admitted to it. But anyway, so they did impose really drastic anti-COVID restrictions. So they even cut off really all foreign trade, including the 90% or so that they trade with China. They even cut off their state-sponsored smuggling that they do to evade UN sanctions. So it's had an impact on their economy. So we think they do have cases. We think they've had cases, and we think they've had deaths. Perhaps not as big as we thought they might have had, given the emaciated condition of their populace, as well as the really minimalist conditions of their hospitals and medical system. But certainly they've had cases, but not as bad as it could have been had they not done those draconian measures. But it did have quite an impact on their economy.
There was a lot of this wild speculation back in 2020 that Kim Jong-un was sick or maybe even died because his sister was somehow more prominent. He wasn't seen for a while. What happened? Do you know?
So back when Kim's father died, even the CIA didn't know he had died for a couple days until North Korea announced he had died. So information on the leader is very difficult to get in North Korea because they keep it very tightly held. So we were saying, look, he may be dead, or he may come back. And I think it was just he was being very cautious about COVID. We think he went out to a sort of a remote villa of his, and and then he came back. I mean, he's obviously not the picture of health given his weight and medical conditions, but he came back looking fairly healthy and robust. So we don't think he had actually been sick.
How good is North Korea at cyber espionage?
Actually very, very good. I'm just finishing research on a project, and even though I've been covering North Korea for many years, I was amazed at how expansive and good they are. People tend to think of, well, North Korea, it's this backward little country. They couldn't possibly either come up with, workable nuclear weapons or missiles that can hit the entire continental U.S., which they can, or cyber. And I remember back in 2014 when Sony was hacked because of that movie called The Interview, which made fun of Kim Jong-un.
Right, yeah.
And over the years, U.S. and South Korean officials have said North Korea is in the top 3 or 4 countries in the world. They've gotten into very secure U.S. and South Korean government and military computers. They've stolen our war plans. They've stolen South Korean defense technology. Now, in recent years, they've shifted to cyber bank robbery and then also going after virtual currency like Bitcoin and stuff. The UN panel of experts estimates they've gotten at least $2 billion in bank robberies and cyber exchanges, and that is likely an underestimate.
We don't see a lot of pictures of North Korea, people and places. Several years ago, some AP journalists spent a week there traveling the country with state censors by their side, taking some rather stark photos, reporting that throughout North Korea, fewer than 500 miles of roads are paved.
North Korea occasionally lets journalists in, and then in many cases they sort of decide, okay, do we want to take them on the things are looking great tour, or do we want to show them the things are looking dire tour?
Okay.
So if they're trying to elicit donations or of humanitarian assistance, they may take them to the schools where the poor children are starving, or the hospitals that don't have supplies or medical equipment, or they may take them on the things are looking great tour, where it's like, so your sanctions are meaningless to us. We are strong. We are robust, et cetera. And I think someone even pointed out once where the random person in the street that the journalists interviewed was actually the same random guy in the street that some other journalists had interviewed, a couple months earlier.
Yeah, and in this particular thing, if you go through the gallery of all the pictures, they none of the people they saw, they didn't even react to what they were seeing, even though they probably had never seen an American before. They didn't even react, probably because they feared a reaction, right?
Very much. They, the people that would interact, even quote unquote randomly with foreign journalists, either are a plant or they would be very concerned about any kind of thing that they said to a foreigner because they know they're probably going to get a visit by the security service, or even just they're innately suspicious of foreigners. The Koreans the North Koreans are taught from an early age that the U.S. Is the enemy. So, even elementary school math problems are things like, if I kill 3 Americans and you kill 2 Americans, how many Americans have we killed?
Are you serious?
Yeah. And, they're taught just very early on that, the Americans are the enemy, that the Americans have done terrible things in the past to them, including during the Korean War, that, we're out to get them, that the reason for the hardship in North Korea is, as they say, because of the hostile policy of the U.S., and things would be great if only those Americans would stop treating them so badly. So they tend to use this, the main enemy threat as a way of justifying the harsh conditions that the populace is suffering, and also to justify the very high percentage of their budget that they put towards the military. They also put a high part of the budget on sort of glorification of the leader, of these thousands of statues throughout the country and occasional huge, massive demonstrations in a stadium with thousands of people, putting on shows, synchronized dancing, et cetera. So, it's, in a way, they need the enemy as a way of justifying both the failure of their economy and the reason why they put so much into their military.
Very interesting indeed. Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Did you hear the news? Now you can. With instant updates from Fox News for Amazon Alexa. Just say,
Alexa, play news from Fox.
In Fox News.
It's the latest when you need it, on demand, from Fox News and Amazon Alexa. Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Dr. Nicole Saphier.
What's on your mind?
Throughout the pandemic, media and technology companies have impulsively discredited some narratives while prematurely promoting others. By some strange coincidence, these decisions almost uniformly align with left-wing policy objectives. Last week, YouTube removed a video of a recent roundtable discussion between Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and several doctors and epidemiologists known for their anti-lockdown opinions. The panel convened to discuss Florida's COVID-19 response, with DeSantis and others criticizing the overall U.S. response while discussing the unintended consequences that have resulted from prolonged lockdowns, mask wearing, and school closures. When the Wall Street Journal asked about the removal, YouTube provided an example of a comment by Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, a Stanford University professor of medicine and research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, who said masking for children is developmentally inappropriate. YouTube further gave the reason for the video's removal as because it included content that contradicts the consensus of local and global health authorities regarding the efficacy of masks to prevent the spread of COVID-19. But even that statement is untrue. Put simply, there is very little local or global consensus on many facets of the pandemic, particularly children wearing masks. Without diving too deep into the minutiae, while the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention may recommend mask wearing in children over 2, the World Health Organization does not. The WHO says children aged 5 years and under should not be required to wear masks, and that for children 6 to 11 years of age, the potential impact of wearing a mask on learning and psychosocial development in consultation with teachers, parents, caregivers, and or medical providers should be considered before having them wear masks. So while comments arguing against children wearing masks may go against Dr. Anthony Fauci and other scientific purists with the singular mission of eradicating a virus, it does not go against other equally reputable sources that emphasize kids wearing face masks may disrupt their development. Reasonable experts can and do disagree. It is this discord that fuels trial and error experimentation and discovery. Science, by its very nature, is rarely settled. In the race for information about the novel virus, technology and media companies have jumped ahead to help shape narratives around partisan policies, despite the science changing by the day. Big tech is collecting massive amounts of data while stifling free speech and removing content that goes against popular opinion. In a public health crisis such as we are still in, it is essential to have transparent discussions on responses and outcomes to help lay a better path for the future. It should not be acceptable for YouTube and Facebook to ban content that conflicts with a certain party's policy enactments. While vaccine hesitancy remains a barrier in vaccination efforts, suppressing contrarian views on Twitter and elsewhere only adds to the growing skepticism. Banning discussion, misinformation or not, does not change the reality that legitimate debate on the subject exists. There is no party of science. Whether we like the conclusions or not, whether we feel comfortable debating the ambiguity or not, the outcomes speak the truth. Suppression efforts do more to discredit and undermine science than conservatism, and that's dangerous. I'm Nicole Saphier, medical contributor for Fox News and author of the book Panic Attack. I wrote this piece in collaboration with former Congressman Jason Chaffetz.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. From the Fox News Podcasts Network.
I'm Ben Domenech, publisher of The Federalist, and I'm inviting you to join a new conversation with the smartest thinkers out there about the country and where we're going. Subscribe to the Ben Domenech Podcast.
Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.